What if I told you that in 1962, the highest-ranking generals in the United States military signed off on a plan to bomb American cities, sink refugee boats full of innocent people, and shoot down a passenger plane, all to trick you into supporting a war? This isn't some wild conspiracy theory from the internet. This is documented fact, declassified by the US government itself. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the men who commanded America's Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, put their signatures on a proposal to murder American civilians and blame it on a foreign enemy. The code name was Operation Northwoods. For nearly 40 years, this plan remained buried in classified files, hidden from the American people who were supposed to be its victims. When the documents finally saw daylight in 2001, even hardened journalists were shocked by what they revealed. Tonight, I'm going to walk you through the entire story, how it was conceived, what exactly they planned to do, why it was created in the first place, and most importantly, how close it came to actually happening. Because understanding Operation Northwoods isn't just about learning a disturbing piece of Cold War history. It's about understanding what governments are capable of when they believe the ends justify the means. If you're interested in declassified documents, government secrets, and the real stories they don't teach in history class, you're going to want to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we dive deep into documented cases like this on this channel. Let's begin with the question: how did America's military leadership even conceive of something this extreme? To understand Operation Northwoods, you need to understand the world it was born into. And that world was absolutely terrified. It's January 1959. Fidel Castro has just marched into Havana after overthrowing Fulgencio Batista, the Cuban dictator who had been friendly to American interests. At first, the United States isn't entirely sure what to make of Castro. Is he a reformer, a nationalist? Something else? The answer comes quickly. Castro begins nationalizing American-owned businesses, oil refineries, sugar plantations, hotels, casinos. Millions of dollars in American assets simply seized by the new Cuban government. Then comes the announcement that changes everything. Cuba is aligning itself with the Soviet Union. Castro declares himself a communist. Let that sink in for a moment. Remember, this is 1959. The Cold War is at its peak. Americans are building bomb shelters in their backyards. School children are practicing duck and cover drills. The entire Western world is locked in an ideological death match with the Soviet Union. And now, communist forces have established a foothold just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. 90 miles. You could see Cuba from Key West on a clear day. For the American government, particularly for the military and intelligence establishment, this was unacceptable. Cuba couldn't be allowed to become a Soviet satellite in America's backyard. Something had to be done, and it had to be done quickly. Enter the CIA and their brilliant plan. The Bay of Pigs invasion. In April 1961, approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles, trained and equipped by the CIA, launched an invasion of Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs. The plan was simple: land, spark an uprising against Castro, and watch his government collapse. President John F. Kennedy, relatively new to office, approved the operation based on assurances from military and intelligence advisors that it would work. It didn't work. The invasion was an absolute disaster. Castro's forces were ready and waiting. Within 3 days, the invasion force was crushed. More than 100 exiles were killed, and nearly 1,200 were captured. The Soviet Union and Cuba used the incident as propaganda gold, painting America as an imperialist aggressor. Kennedy was humiliated on the world stage. And worse, he realized he'd been given catastrophically bad advice by the very military and intelligence leaders who were supposed to be the experts. The president was furious, but more than that, he was cautious. He'd learned a hard lesson about trusting the war hawks in his administration. He publicly took responsibility for the failure, but privately, He was deeply skeptical of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and their push for a direct military action against Cuba. But the military leaders, they weren't chastened. They were frustrated. From their perspective, the Bay of Pigs failed because Kennedy hadn't provided enough support. No US air cover, no direct military involvement. They believed that if America had gone in with full force, Castro would have been toppled. The problem wasn't the strategy. The problem was the execution. The problem was political weakness. And so they began to think, what would it take to remove that political weakness? What would it take to make direct military intervention not just possible, but inevitable? Throughout 1961 and into 1962, the Kennedy administration launched Operation Mongoose, a program of sabotage, propaganda, and covert operations designed to undermine Castro's government from the shadows. But for the Joint Chiefs, this cloak and dagger stuff wasn't enough. They wanted war. They wanted invasion. They wanted Castro removed by American military force. But they faced a problem. The American people didn't want war with Cuba, not after the Bay of Pigs embarrassment, not without a clear, undeniable reason. So the generals asked themselves a question that would lead to one of the most shocking documents in American history. What if we gave them a reason? Asterisk, picture this. It's early 1962. Inside the Pentagon, in secured rooms where America's highest-ranking military officers meet, a document is being drafted. It's stamped top secret. The title reads, Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. The authors aren't fringe elements or rogue operatives. This document is being prepared by the Joint Chiefs of Staff themselves, General Lyman, Lemnitzer, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, along with the heads of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. These are the men at the very pinnacle of American military power. On March 13, 1962, they present this memorandum to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. What's inside is breathtaking in its cynicism. The core concept is simple. If Cuba won't give us a reason to invade, we'll create one ourselves. They called it Operation Northwoods. Now, before I go into the specifics of what they proposed, I want you to understand something. These weren't vague suggestions or hypothetical scenarios thrown out in a brainstorming session. This was a formal, military proposal, approved and signed by every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This document was meant to go to the President of the United States as a serious recommendation. The strategy was based on what's called a false flag operation. The US military would carry out attacks and acts of violence, then blame them on Cuba. The goal was to create what the document itself called a helpful wave of national indignation that would make war not just acceptable, but demanded by the American people. Let me read you that phrase again. A helpful wave of national indignation. They were planning to manipulate the emotions of the American public through deception and violence. So, what exactly did they propose? First, they suggested staging a terror campaign on American soil. Specifically, they talked about bombing U.S. cities, Miami, Washington, D.C., other targets. The plan called for creating a Cuban communist terror campaign that would include actual explosives, actual destruction, and the very real possibility of American casualties. These wouldn't be harmless false flags. People could die. The document explicitly stated that the objective was to create incidents that would appear to be the work of Cuban agents or Cuban sympathizers. The American people would see the destruction, read about the casualties in their newspapers, and demand retaliation against Castro. Second, they proposed attacking Cuban refugees and exiles. Think about that for a moment. These were people who had fled Castro's regime, many of them at great personal risk. Some had fought alongside the CIA at the Bay of Pigs, and now the U.S. military was suggesting killing them to create a pretext for war. One specific idea was to sink boats full of Cuban refugees in the waters between Cuba and Florida. Then blame Castro's forces for the attack. The optics would be perfect. Innocent People fleeing communism, murdered by the very regime they were escaping from. The Cuban exile community in Miami, already influential in American politics, would be outraged. They would demand action, and their demands would carry weight. Third, and perhaps most elaborately, they proposed faking a Cuban attack on a U.S. aircraft. Here's how it would work. They would take a civilian airliner and secretly repaint it to look like a U.S. Air Force plane. Meanwhile, they would charter a real flight, possibly filled with college students supposedly heading to vacation. This real plane would have a different tail number, but would file a flight plan over Cuban airspace. Then comes the deception. They would fly an unmanned drone version of the Air Force plane over Cuba. This drone would broadcast a distress signal, saying it was under attack by Cuban forces. Then, by remote control, they would destroy the drone. The US government would announce that Cuba had shot down an unarmed American passenger plane, killing dozens of innocent students. The real plane with the real passengers would land safely somewhere else, but the public would never know. They would only know that Cuba had committed an act of war against defenseless Americans. Does this sound familiar to anyone? Years later, when people questioned the official narratives of certain events, Operation Northwoods became exhibitor in those debates, because it proved that yes, the US government really had considered staging elaborate deceptions involving aircraft, casualties, and manufactured evidence. Fourth, they proposed blowing up a US Navy ship in Guantanamo Bay and blaming Cuba. The document specifically mentioned how casualty lists published in American newspapers would generate that helpful wave of national indignation they were looking for. They were willing to sacrifice American sailors, or at minimum, make the world believe American sailors had been killed, all to create martyrs for their cause. This idea had historical precedent. In 1898, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing over 250 American sailors. The rallying cry "Remember the Maine" helped push America into the Spanish-American War. It was later determined that the Maine probably exploded due to an internal accident, not Spanish sabotage, but by then it didn't matter. The war had already been fought and won. The architects of Northwoods knew their history. They wanted to recreate that moment, deliberately this time. Fifth, they proposed staging attacks in other Latin American countries and blaming Cuba. The idea was to make Castro look like an aggressor, threatening the entire hemisphere, not just the United States. They suggested faking Cuban Air Force attacks on places like the Dominican Republic or Haiti, or planting Cuban weapons on beaches in allied nations to make it appear that Castro was arming insurgencies throughout the Caribbean. All of these proposals shared one common thread: deception backed by violence or the appearance of violence, and all of them were designed to manipulate American public opinion and international opinion into supporting a war that nobody actually wanted except the Joint Chiefs themselves. Reading these documents decades later, one investigative journalist called Operation Northwoods perhaps the most corrupt plan ever created by the US government. That journalist was James Bamford, and he's the reason we know about any of this. But we'll get to that part of the story shortly. The crucial thing to understand is this: Operation Northwoods wasn't the fantasy of some lunatic fringe. It was official military policy, recommended by the highest-ranking generals in America, men who commanded hundreds of thousands of troops and had access to nuclear weapons. On March 13, 1962, this document landed on the desk of Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. The question became, what would the civilian leadership do with it? Robert McNamara was one of the sharpest minds in the Kennedy administration. He'd come from the business world, where he'd been president of Ford Motor Company, and he brought an analytical, systems-based approach to running the Department of Defense. He was not a man prone to emotional decision-making. When the Northwoods memorandum reached him, McNamara's response was reportedly swift and negative. He rejected the plan. But here's what's significant: the document had reached that high. It had been approved by every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff before it ever got to McNamara. That meant the entire top tier of America's military leadership had looked at proposals to bomb American cities and kill American citizens, and they had said yes. Let that sink in. McNamara's rejection meant the plan would not go forward to President Kennedy, at least not with the Defense Secretary's approval. But Kennedy became aware of the proposals anyway, and his reaction was one of alarm and distrust. Remember, Kennedy had already been burned by the Joint Chiefs. Their advice on the Bay of Pigs had been disastrously wrong. Now they were coming to him with proposals that went beyond aggressive military planning into something much darker. Proposals that violated fundamental principles of democracy and human decency. Kennedy said no, absolutely not. The president made it clear that the United States would not engage in false flag terrorism against its own people, whatever his concerns about Castro and Cuba. And they were real concerns. He would not pursue them through deception and murder. But the damage to Kennedy's relationship with his military leadership was profound. The president had already been skeptical of the Joint Chiefs after the Bay of Pigs. Now he viewed them as dangerous ideologues, men so fixated on their strategic objectives that they'd lost sight of moral boundaries. Within months, Kennedy effectively removed General Lyman Lemnitzer from his position as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Officially, Lemnitzer's term simply wasn't renewed, and he was reassigned to serve as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in Europe. It was framed as a lateral move, but those close to the situation understood what it really meant. Kennedy wanted Lemnitzer out of Washington. The timing is telling. Kennedy declined to reappoint Lemnitzer in late 1962, just months after the Northwoods proposal and shortly after another major confrontation, the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, American intelligence discovered that the Soviet Union was installing nuclear missiles in Cuba. For 13 days, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. Kennedy's military advisors, including many of the same Joint Chiefs who had proposed Northwoods, pushed hard for an immediate military strike on Cuba. They wanted to bomb the missile sites, invade the island, and remove Castro once and for all. Kennedy refused. Instead, he pursued a strategy of naval blockade and diplomatic negotiation. The generals were furious, convinced that the president was showing weakness, that this was the perfect opportunity to solve the Cuba problem permanently. But Kennedy saw something they didn't: that an invasion of Cuba would almost certainly trigger a Soviet response, and that could escalate into World War III. The president was willing to negotiate, to find an off-ramp, even if it meant appearing less than tough. In the end, Kennedy's approach worked. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for American assurances not to invade the island, and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. Nuclear war was averted, but the Joint Chiefs saw it differently. To them, Kennedy had squandered another opportunity to remove Castro. First, he'd refused to support the Bay of Pigs properly, then he'd rejected Northwoods, and now he'd negotiated with the Soviets instead of striking. From their perspective, the president was soft on communism. From Kennedy's perspective, his generals were reckless warmongers who couldn't see beyond their own desire for military action. This tension between civilian and military leadership is one of the most important aspects of the Northwoods story. In a democracy, the military is supposed to be subordinate to civilian control. The president, as commander-in-chief, makes the final decisions about war and peace, not the generals. Operation Northwoods was, in many ways, an attempt to circumvent that structure. If the Joint Chiefs could manipulate public opinion through false flag attacks, they could create a political environment where the president had no choice but to go to war. They would be, in effect, making the decision for him. Kennedy's refusal to go along with it was an assertion of civilian authority over military planning. It was the democratic system working as intended, but it also revealed how close that system came to failing. Because here's the uncomfortable question: what if McNamara had approved it? What if he'd brought it to Kennedy and presented it as a serious option? What if Kennedy, under enormous pressure after the Bay of Pigs failure, had been persuaded that this was the only way to deal with the Cuba problem. We like to think that obviously it would never have happened, that someone would have stopped it. But the fact is, it got surprisingly far before someone did stop it. After Kennedy rejected Northwoods, the plan was filed away. The documents were stamped top secret and locked in Pentagon archives. The American people had no idea that their military leadership had even considered such actions. The Cuban exile community, which would have been targeted in some of the proposals, never knew how close they came to being used as props in a staged atrocity. And for the next 3.5 decades, Operation Northwoods remained one of the government's most closely guarded secrets. The plan was dead, but the documents survived. And eventually, as we'll see, those documents would come to light in a way nobody could have predicted. Asterisk for 35 years. Operation Northwoods was one of the best kept secrets in American government. Think about that time span. 35 years. From 1962 to 1997. Through the rest of the Cold War, through Vietnam, through Watergate, through every political scandal and revelation of government wrongdoing that came to light during those turbulent decades, nobody knew about Northwoods. The men who planned it remained silent. General Lemnitzer went on to serve as NATO's supreme commander until 1969, then retired from military service. He lived until 1988, never publicly speaking about the operation that bore his signature. The other Joint Chiefs who approved the plans similarly took the secret to their graves or kept it locked away in their memories. Robert McNamara, who rejected the plan, served as Defense Secretary until 1968, then went on to head the World Bank. In his later years, he became more reflective about his time in government, even expressing regrets about Vietnam. But even McNamara didn't publicly reveal Operation Northwoods during his lifetime. President Kennedy never got the chance. He was assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963, less than 2 years after rejecting the Northwoods proposals. His death brought Lyndon Johnson to the presidency, and Johnson would have his own confrontations with the Joint Chiefs over Vietnam. But the Cuba question faded somewhat from center stage. The documents themselves sat in classified files in the Pentagon and the National Archives. They were protected by secrecy classifications that, in theory, could have kept them hidden forever. After all, the government isn't required to declassify everything. Some secrets remain secret. So why did Operation Northwoods ever come to light? The answer involves one of the most significant events in modern American history, the assassination of President Kennedy. In the decades following Kennedy's death, questions about the assassination persisted. Was Lee Harvey Oswald really a lone gunman? Were there other conspirators? Did the government know more than it was telling the public? By the 1990s, pressure had mounted for a comprehensive release of all government documents related to Kennedy's assassination. In 1992, Congress passed the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. This law created the Assassination Records Review Board, a civilian agency tasked with collecting and declassifying documents related to Kennedy's death and the surrounding historical period. The idea was to put everything out in the open, to let researchers and the public see whatever the government had. The review board was given broad authority to examine classified files from the early 1960s. They went through Pentagon records, CIA files, FBI documents, anything that might shed light on Kennedy's presidency and death. And on November 18, 1997, the Assassination Records Review Board released a massive trove of previously classified documents minus 1,521 pages of military records from 1962 to 1964. Buried in that document dump was the Operation Northwoods memorandum. It wasn't released because someone thought it was particularly important or because there was public demand for it. It was released as part of a wholesale declassification effort related to Kennedy. The review board probably didn't realize they were releasing one of the most explosive documents in Cold War history. They were just doing their job. making everything public. And at first, nothing happened. The documents were released, placed in the National Archives, made available to researchers. But in 1997, this was before the age of viral internet sharing, before digital documents could be instantly spread across the world. Researchers had to actually go to the archives, physically review documents, understand what they were looking at. The Northwoods memo sat there, technically public, but unknown to almost everyone, for 3.5 years. Then, in 2001, an investigative journalist named James Bamford was researching a book about the National Security Agency and U.S. intelligence operations. Bamford was known for his meticulous research and his ability to uncover classified information that the government preferred to keep hidden. While digging through those declassified 1997 documents, Bamford found Operation Northwoods. He couldn't believe what he was reading. Bamford included a section on Northwoods in his book Body of Secrets, which was published in April 2001. The book detailed the history of the NSA, but the Northwoods section caught immediate attention. Here was documentary proof that America's military leadership had proposed staging terrorist attacks on American soil, killing American civilians, and blaming it on Cuba to justify a war. The mainstream media picked up the story immediately. ABC News ran a major piece headlined "U.S. Military Wanted to Provoke War with Cuba." The article detailed the proposals, the bombings, the sinking of refugee boats, the plan to fake the destruction of a passenger plane. Americans were shocked. How had this never been revealed before? How could their military leaders have even considered such a thing? Bamford was quoted extensively in the media coverage. He called Operation Northwoods perhaps the most corrupt plan ever created by the U.S. government. He pointed out that the Joint Chiefs had kept these documents secret for so long precisely because they were ashamed of what they had approved. The timing of the revelation is worth noting. Body of Secrets was published in April 2001. The story of Operation Northwoods hit the news in late April and early May of that year. 5 months later, on September 11, 2001, terrorists attacked the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. In the wake of 9/11s, Operation Northwoods took on new significance for many people. Some pointed to it as evidence that governments do, in fact, consider false flag operations. Conspiracy theories about 9/11s often cited Northwoods as proof that such a plan wasn't beyond the realm of possibility. To be clear, there is no credible evidence that 9/11s was a false flag operation. The attacks were carried out by Al-Qaeda terrorists, and that conclusion is supported by overwhelming evidence. But the existence of Operation Northwoods made certain people more skeptical of official narratives, more willing to question whether the government was telling the whole truth. And that's part of the lasting impact of Northwoods. Once you know that America's military leadership seriously considered staging terrorist attacks and blaming them on a foreign enemy, it becomes harder to completely trust official explanations of events. The knowledge that it was proposed, even though it was rejected, changes your understanding of what governments are capable of. Asterisks. What do we do with this information? What does Operation Northwoods tell us about government, about democracy, about the world we live in? Let's start with the most important fact. The plan was rejected. It never happened. The system, in this case, worked. Civilian oversight prevented a catastrophic moral failure by the military leadership. Robert McNamara and President Kennedy drew a line and said no. That matters. It means that even in the midst of Cold War paranoia, even with intense pressure to do something about Cuba, there were people in positions of authority who refused to sacrifice democratic principles for strategic gain. But the flip side of that is equally important. It got as far as it did. Every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff approved Operation Northwoods before it reached McNamara. These weren't rogue elements or fringe figures. These were the men at the very top of America's military command structure. What does that tell us about institutional culture in the Pentagon during that era? What does it tell us about how military leaders thought about civilian casualties about deception, about the ends justifying the means? The answer is uncomfortable. In the Cold War mindset, where existential conflict with communism dominated all strategic thinking, some leaders were willing to consider almost anything if they believed it would serve national security. The threat of communism, particularly communist expansion in the Western Hemisphere, was seen as so dire that proposals we would now view as obviously immoral were treated as serious policy options. This is one of the dangers of threat inflation. When you convince yourself that the enemy is so dangerous, so evil, so existential, you can justify actions that would otherwise be unthinkable. The Joint Chiefs who proposed Northwoods genuinely believed that Castro's Cuba represented a grave threat to American security. In their minds, they were considering extreme measures to deal with an extreme threat. But here's the thing, Castro's Cuba was never actually an existential threat to the United States. Yes, it was a communist nation aligned with the Soviet Union. Yes, that was a problem for US strategic interests. But Cuba was a small, poor island nation of a few million people. It didn't have the capacity to seriously threaten America's existence. The missile crisis in October 1962 was dangerous, but that danger came from Soviet missiles, not from Cuba itself. And even that crisis was resolved through diplomacy, without a single shot being fired in anger. So Operation Northwoods was, in many ways, a grotesque overreaction to a manageable problem. It reveals how threat perception can become distorted, how the desire to act can override moral reasoning. Another lesson from Northwoods is about the importance of transparency and oversight in a democracy. The plan remained secret for 35 years. During all that time, the American people had no idea that their military leadership had ever considered such actions. They couldn't hold anyone accountable because they didn't know what had been proposed. It was only through the somewhat accidental process of declassification related to Kennedy's assassination that the documents came to light. If Congress hadn't mandated that declassification, if the Assassination Records Review Board hadn't done its work, if James Bamford hadn't been digging through archives for his book, we might still not know about Operation Northwoods today. Think about that. One of the most important revelations about Cold War-era military planning came to light only because of factors unrelated to the plan itself. How many other Operation Northwoods-style proposals might exist in classified files? How many other plans, rejected or approved, have never seen the light of day? We can't know. And that's precisely the problem with excessive government secrecy. In a democracy, the people are supposed to be sovereign. But how can you exercise sovereignty? How can you hold leaders accountable if you don't know what they're doing in your name? The Northwoods revelation also changed how many people view the concept of false flag operations. Before 2001, if you suggested that a government might stage attacks and blame them on an enemy, you'd be dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. The term false flag was associated with paranoia and fringe thinking. After Northwoods became public, that changed. Now we have documentary proof that false flag operations have been seriously considered at the highest levels of the US government. That doesn't mean every conspiracy theory is true. Most aren't. But it does mean we can't simply dismiss the concept as impossible or beyond the pale. Governments do consider deception as a tool of policy. They do, in some circumstances, create pretexts for actions they want to take. Operation Northwoods proves that. For many Americans, particularly those of the generation who lived through the Cold War and Vietnam, Northwoods confirmed suspicions they'd long held about government dishonesty. It fit into a broader pattern of revelations from that era. The Pentagon Papers showing the government had lied about Vietnam. CIA documents revealing assassination plots against foreign leaders. FBI files showing domestic surveillance of civil rights leaders. Each revelation eroded public trust a little more. Northwoods was particularly damaging because it showed that military leaders had been willing to target American civilians, not foreign enemies, not even foreign civilians, but Americans on American soil. That's a profound betrayal of the military's fundamental duty to protect the citizens of the nation it serves. Yet we also need to acknowledge the human element here. The men who proposed Operation Northwoods weren't cartoon villains. They were career military officers who had dedicated their lives to defending the United States. Many of them had fought in World War II. They genuinely believed they were acting in America's best interests. The road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions. General Lemnitzer and his colleagues thought they were being hard-headed realists, making tough decisions in a dangerous world. They convinced themselves that the threat justified the means. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong, but they weren't acting out of malice or hatred for their own country. This is important to understand because it shows how good people can arrive at terrible conclusions when they're operating within a distorted ethical framework. The Cold War created that framework, a world divided into absolute good and absolute evil, where victory was the only thing that mattered, where the survival of freedom, as they understood it, justified almost any action. In that context, Operation Northwoods made a kind of twisted sense. If Castro had to be removed, and if the American people wouldn't support removal without a dramatic provocation, then create the provocation. Problem solved. Except it wasn't solved, because the problem wasn't really Castro. The problem was the mindset that allowed military leaders to view their own citizens as acceptable casualties in a geopolitical chess game. President Kennedy understood this, which is why he rejected the plan. He saw that Northwoods wasn't just strategically questionable, it was morally bankrupt. It would have made America the thing it claimed to be fighting against, a regime willing to murder innocents for political purposes. We're now more than 60 years past Operation Northwoods. The Cold War is over. Fidel Castro is dead. The Soviet Union has collapsed. The world that created Northwoods no longer exists. But the lessons remain relevant. We live in an age where trust in institutions is at historic lows. People are skeptical of government, of media, of established authority. Some of that skepticism is healthy. Some of it slides into conspiracy thinking that loses touch with reality. Operation Northwoods sits at that intersection. It's a real conspiracy, documented and declassified, that proves governments do consider deceptive and violent options. But it's also a story of how the system can work, how civilian oversight and moral leadership can prevent terrible ideas from becoming reality. The question we have to ask ourselves is, are those safeguards still in place? Do we have leaders today who would say no to a modern Operation Northwoods? Do we have institutions strong enough to prevent such plans from moving forward? I don't have a definitive answer to those questions, and I suspect they don't have simple answers. What I do know is that vigilance is essential, transparency is essential, an informed public is essential. Operation Northwoods remained secret for 35 years. In that time, the men who proposed it lived their lives, some receiving honors and respect for their service. They were never held accountable because accountability requires knowledge, and the American people didn't have knowledge. Now we do. The documents are public. The story has been told. We know what was proposed and who proposed it. That knowledge is powerful, but only if we use it. Only if we remember that democracy requires more than just voting every few years. It requires constant attention to what government does in our name. It requires asking hard questions and demanding honest answers. It requires rejecting the premise that national security justifies anything and everything. The architects of Operation Northwoods believed the ends justified the means. President Kennedy believed some means are so repugnant that no end can justify them. History has judged Kennedy right. As we navigate our own era of international tensions, terrorism, and security threats, we would do well to remember that judgment. There are always people who will argue that desperate times require desperate measures, that we need to set aside our principles to survive. Operation Northwoods stands as a warning about where that logic leads. If you found this deep dive into declassified history valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We're committed to bringing you documented, factual investigations into the stories that powerful people would prefer remained hidden. Check out the description for links to the actual declassified Northwoods documents. You can read them yourself. The truth is out there, not in conspiracy theories, but in the archives, waiting to be discovered. And sometimes, the truth is more disturbing than any fiction. Thanks for watching.